one of the big pieces here at X is that success isn't measured by like the up and to the right curve of what you're doing. Success is actually measured by how much are you killing at the front end so that you can make capacity for higher level impact things. And that's akin to a lot of the stuff we do with rapid evaluation. That's akin to a lot of the stuff that we do when we're vetting ideas. But first and foremost, I think the thing that makes you successful at X is that you're not just you understand that professional breakthrough is not possible without personal breakthrough. Like, you have to be willing to put your ego aside, turn up the humility factor, level set that with some audaciousness, and then go try something you've never tried before and be okay that it might not be successful, or it might just totally confuse folks. But at least, like, what do you do with the learning that comes after that?
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the HR Heretics podcast, where we get into the real talk of company construction. These are the conversations that happen between founders, chief people officers, and board members behind closed doors.
We're heretics in this industry because there's a culture of silence around important business topics, especially with people. But on the show, we tell the truth and expect the same from our guests.
Today, our episode is with AJ Thomas. AJ was an incredible guest. Her background is so diverse. Nolan, she's been an operator, an advisor, a board member, all things talent, currently at the Moonshot factory at Google X for almost over 4 years, and has written 2 children's books to boot.
Yeah, AJ is an ass kicker, is the best way I would describe her. She also thinks very differently than the majority of our guests. And she tells a couple of stories, which I love. One is the onboarding story, in which they tried to onboard people at the Moonshot factory via an escape room. And highlight for the audience, it didn't work. It failed. And then we asked her about tell us about that failure, and then how you talked about that failure, and then how you learned from that failure to build what your onboarding process currently is. I love that. And I thought that was entirely unique.
Yeah. Peeling back the Moonshot factory experience, it was like, we all know about it, Nolan, right? It's out there, but getting into literally how do they do things, and it being counter and almost opposite to how you would expect things to normally happen, right? Like removing performance management systems, being expected to fail, unable to have professional breakthroughs without personal breakthroughs, and what that means and how they think about that. So good. And just all those things that she interviews for and how she operates. I was like, how do people go in there and adapt? Right? How do you onboard there?
She also perfectly hit on one of my philosophies in recruiting, which is actively selling against the company at the end of the process with candidates to ensure they really want to work there. I just think AJ's takes and the way that she thinks about people and about talent, it's part of the future. And so our audience is going to love this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share. And without further ado, here's AJ. AJ, welcome to HR Heretics. We're so stoked to have you.
Hey. Stoked too.
Hey. All right.
Hey.
So your career journey is incredible. And in our prep call, one of the interesting things that I don't think a lot of people know about you is the auction.com story. So can you tell our audience that story?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really interesting story because, number one, the offer letter I got from auction.com, I got hired by auction.com. Offer letter I got was from auction.com. It rebranded into 10X in the 2 weeks that it took me to start there. So all of my onboarding swag was actually 10X. And I actually should have seen this as a foretelling of some of the things that were going to happen in the horizon. What's been really fun about that story, I think, is just the massive learning and running into walls and probably turning into slime and reincarnating as many different things in the business. But I had the opportunity to succeed a really fantastic leader there, Chris Galley, when he left his chief people officer seat, and I assumed a CHRO at Auction, leading their people and culture team. What was interesting about that journey was going on the pre-IPO journey as I started, and then making a massive pivot after an acquisition of a PE firm, and then having to split up our commercial, our residential businesses, and our kind of technology businesses into 3 different parts. So a joint venture, a carve out, and then living the post-acquisition to rebuild auction.com. And mind you, if you take a look at that like little slice in my career, I was there for 3 years. So the massive amount of change and tsunami to try to build, rebuild, unbuild, and decode kind of what we were going to be in the future, those were very, very hard things that I think I had to move through. But that's kind of just like the general overview of the experience that I've had there. So we can go down
those
that
3 years
whole...
probably felt, yeah, those 3 years probably felt like 8, if I'm guessing.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like I gained 20 years of experience in just navigating chaos, which, you know, led me to the role that I went into afterwards. But I gotta say, the exposure to the board, private equity teams, consultants, and then having to manage the talent on the team and try to connect, you know, we talk in employee experience, right? When you're really in that mode, what even is employee experience? Like, you are really trying to get to the center of what is the business need while the business is trying to figure out what the business experience is. So I think that's crazy.
I've worked in a company to where one of the things that showed up on the employee survey was that they felt thrashed. And what you just described feels like way more than thrashed. That feels like a boat that's like sinking and then being rebuilt and then turning into a cruise ship, and now it's a warship. How did you communicate with employees through all of that change?
You know, what was really awesome about that was before I came into the seat and worked with the CEO that was there, my CEO, who's absolutely fantastic. I mean, he really had a vision for the industry change he wanted to make with auction. And mind you, we were in the foreclosure real estate business, right? So of course that's also very hard to try and figure out, okay, how do we create a mission driven factor around that? What I would say was what really helped me was before stepping into the role, I went on the road think about it as like undercover boss, but not really, because, you know, there was just a lot going on at that time, but I really felt it was important for me to sit in the seat of the auctioneer. I mean, I was running coffee back and forth in our courthouses in Atlanta and in Texas, just trying to get to know what they saw at the very forefront.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I just had a vision of AJ having like 20 properties that she's acquired.
That's right. That's right. That's right. But what was really interesting about that was, for me personally, I like to spend time with the people at the forefront, right? So, you know, in order for you to drive true systemic change, you have to actually experience the people and their experience of touching the problem. This is not about user research. This is not about sitting there and reading an insight report or gathering some data, but actually sitting within the business and saying, hey, I just want to understand what this looks like. I didn't actually even tell them what my role was. I just introduced myself as AJ. I'm an auctioneer for the day. I'm going to help out with the auctions operations team. I got to learn how cash is transferred from the courthouse footsteps to the digital transfer of all of those different pieces. I got to really meet some fantastic people that, again, our auction teams were part-time, right? Because you don't have auctions happening all the time. But I got to meet some of the different stories that they had around why they were in the business, how many of them had been in there for a while. And it actually helped me in my role think about what are the kind of things we need to do to connect to folks so that we can create the policies from a people and talent perspective. This actually led us to something really interesting. We created a partnership with the Urban League in Atlanta, which was pretty fantastic because the Urban League in Atlanta is the oldest and the founding chapter of the Urban League. And we created a returnship program before the returnship program was a thing. where we brought out some of our leaders. I mean, this was after I had spent time, as an auctioneer, wearing the neon green shirt, running around from one place to another, and really had the opportunity to, we had to scale, 100 or so more auctioneers within a span of maybe 3 weeks, because we had a whole huge kind of business of foreclosures that came in, and we needed more folks running those operations. And so what we did was we put a call out to folks that were looking for part-time roles, but we didn't post roles. We posted it as an event for learning, upskilling, resume building, and then having an event and a lunch where they could learn about auction.com. And then we said, hey, by the way, if you come back Thursday and Friday, I took my L&D team there. We did training and everything for them around what the systems look like. And we said, if you want to come back, some of our hiring managers will be here. And we were able to make offers on the spot for folks. And so that was an ability to kind of outreach with the community. I would not have been able to do that again without the partnership of the team, but also without the experience of actually being on the ground and seeing what they see, and seeing, that if we posted these roles online, people won't apply. Because some of them
really
don't
cool.
Look at it. So that's just an example of and again, it could be a different variable or context for different businesses, but for auction, that was kind of one of the right things to do. So
very creative. Kind of reminds me of our work trials conversation, Nolan, just kind of different strategies for different companies. AJ, you mentioned that we've talked about the thrashing and the change in path very quickly. I empathize. We talked about kind of the Looker IPO path transitioning almost overnight to an acquisition on some former episodes. I guess for the audience, how do you go through that? Because I think one of the myths is that we know what's going on at all times. We're behind all this. We're Oz that's creating. Sometimes we don't know about things, and we literally have to take action 24 hours after we just took a hard right turn. So how do you do that? And what are some tactics and some mental models you've had to get through that? Because we have to go through that, and then we have to take along 1,000 people with us the next day.
Oh, absolutely. So there's this one concept I've actually been playing around, right? So there's a lot of change happening in the market, and everyone is always responding to the variables, right? Variable this, RTO that, blah, 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 whatever it may be, whatever the change is, those are variables. And I think for me, in hindsight, one of the discoveries I had was really to look at it more as an equation, go from a variable mindset to what is the equation for what you're trying to optimize for. I think the most underrated question for people leaders is, awesome, we want to go in that direction. What are we trying to optimize for? It's very easy to be in a meeting where everyone's like, oh yeah, we believe profits should go up and we should engage employees and we should do all of the right things all the time. But it's very easy to just get the nodding heads and get the agree with, right? But no one ever wants to go really that deeper detail of agreeing to. Okay, fantastic. We agree that we're going to go on this journey of change. That's awesome. I agree with it too. However, I want to talk about what are we agreeing to? And usually that's where the meat is, right? Because otherwise everyone's just agreeing with the variables, but they don't actually agree with how are we going to do that? And then you end up saddled with, oh, now you got to go respond to 15 different things that you hadn't planned for.
The root of all frustration is misaligned expectations. And so if you want to go back to that first principles thinking around, can I pressure test my values in a way, my initiatives, all of that, you can always go back to, we are frustrated or having friction because we have misaligned expectations. Let's get curious. Can we talk again? What are we optimizing for? Anyway.
The first thing I always ask employees or whoever it is when there's that kind of thing is what do you want? What do you want? And sometimes they can't answer.
Yeah. They don't even know what they are.
That was great. Hey, everyone. We'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
There's a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and deeply intuitive. Attio makes that a reality. Attio is a radically new CRM built specifically for the new era of companies. It's flexible, easily configures to your unique data structures, works for any go-to-market motion from self-serve to sales-led. Attio automatically enriches your contacts, syncs your emails and calendar, let you create powerful reports, and quickly build Zapier-style automations. The next era of companies deserves more than a one-size-fits-all CRM with an outdated UX. Join OpenAI, Replicate, 11 Labs, and more. Try Attio instantly at attio.com. That's ATTIO.com, and tell them Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretics sent you. Totally. It's basically what you're saying is let's prioritize what we're optimizing for. One of my favorite CEOs used to say, well, Nolan, it's not or, it's and. And I think that's like a lot of times what you'll hear from leadership teams is like, well, AJ,
Yeah.
can't you walk and chew gum? And so how did you really force that conversation when, from the CEO level, they want you to do everything?
Yeah, so a part of this, when you're really sitting in those seats, is getting really good at the scenario planning, right? Everyone always loves the plan. But scenario planning, when it's like, hey, what is it going to look like when it's the worst case? What does it look like at the ideal state that we want? And what does it look like if we overachieve on the ideal state? And actually, I wasn't even assigned to work on any of the change work streams for this specific role. I was actually just having conversations with some of the consultants that had come in. And I was like, and they were actually looking for someone to help drive the change management part of it, right? But part of it is actually understanding the first principles of the change. Like, what were we really trying to optimize for when it came to the business? What were we really trying to optimize for when it came to the people? And then what does it look like in day-to-day practice, right? And sometimes what happens is we're so focused on wordsmithing the communications that we're sending out that we, and in some cases you focus on it and then you connect it to what you think the principles might be for that change. But for example, the ability for us to communicate that we were going to downturn a portion of the workforce because we were making this massive change within the business wasn't something where we were saying, okay, we're just going to come up with a list of folks and then let's go figure out what needs to happen from there. It was actually sitting down and saying, how are we going to communicate this in a way where we met where those businesses were? And then working with the local leadership and the GMs around that instead of, well, we got this blanket general and then everybody hooks onto that. No, there's a very different way. Some teams needed an all hands with one-on-one follow-ups. Some teams were okay with just email communications. Right. But a lot of it was really understanding the nuances of that. And I think when you're driving at that level of change, it's not only important to say, yes, and let's prioritize what we're optimizing. It's also, what's the philosophy? Great. This is what we believe in. What's the process? Okay, we're going to notify people. We're going to do it on this date, etc. But then what are the actual practices? Oh, okay. Well, for this specific people, we got to make sure that it's this. For this leader needs to make sure. So driving change with this effort and this type of velocity requires a deep customization in the day-to-day practice of what hits, but a really rooted foundation around what is the philosophy. I think sometimes what happens in our industry is we kind of blanket that change. Be like, okay, great. We've done our job. We've notified this business unit. We've done the wordsmithing on the comms. It's on the intranet. Did someone talk to PR about this? Anyone going to pick this up that we need to make sure we talk to? So it is also establishing the cross-functional teams that are going to have the, downstream effects as well. Get them involved in the planning, but don't just plan, scenario plan.
Get to the lowest level of detail. I totally agree with you. You then end up after auction.com at X, and X is the Moonshot factory at Google. And funny story for our audience, in 2011, I was a recruiting coordinator and I was running around for the former head of X, Astro Teller, and then the second former head of X, Mike Cassidy. And I was doing interviews for them and running candidates to them. And these were the most interesting people in the world. These were people who were working on propulsion and getting satellites into low Earth orbit. And I just remember every time I interacted with that group, I was like, this is the coolest shit I've ever seen. and you end up running talent experience there. So tell us the story of how you
Yeah.
landed there and what it's been like working there.
Yeah, so how I landed there, I mean, it was what, nearly 3 years at auction. I mean, like we said, Kelly, 20 years with the amount of change we had to
Yes.
go through. I think our team was going through a system implementation at the time, and we were looking at ways to figure out what kind of ATS we were going to go after. A couple team members and I actually sat together and we were like, okay, what are some ATSs that are awesome? Right? Okay, greenhouse, lever, I mean, like all of these. There's Ceridian had one, Workday had one, etc. And a couple of us actually sat down and said, well, what are some companies that are currently using these right now? Like the whole user aspect piece of this was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't we go and just send out applications just to see what we get back, to test the functionality real time before, we actually talk to anyone from a sales perspective. X was on the list. I had never heard of X before. I didn't know anything about what was going on there. I had actually put in an application, just like, okay, they have a role, fantastic. It was for like a head of talent role. And I got to tell you, 45 minutes later, I got an email from a recruiter with a Google domain. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I did not apply to Google. I don't know what this is. Long story long on that one. The recruiter ended up being a member of my team, as I'm part of that team now. But they said it was the most interesting application they'd ever seen before, because it actually led to something that talked about use cases and case studies of things that we'd done, of which one of them was that Urban League story I told you guys about. One conversation led to another, and what was really interesting there was the person who was running talent was actually a rotational leader from legal. Who then was like, you seem just a little bit weird enough. Like, let's continue to have conversations. And then the next thing we knew, they were like, okay, maybe not for this role, but would you be interested in this? And that's how I ended up getting my start at X, looking after the entire people products team, which consisted of L&D, people analytics, HR operations, performance management, talent operations, HR gen, kind of mixed and mashed together, but then also managing a lot of changes from there also.
Yeah.
All came from, let's just go apply and see what ATSs bring us back.
Yeah. AJ, what's it like there, right? Everyone in my, 24 years in Valley and tech, everyone's like, ooh, X, the Moonshot factory. And what's it? Any myth busters of like, hey, everyone might think it's this, it's really like this. How do you work there? Is it different? People think it's like you're on Mars and you're doing things like 180 everyone else. Is that true? How are you successful there?
How you're successful here at X, I think, is very anti to how folks think about success. And I think it's largely in part to kind of Nolan, what you were saying about, Mike and Astro. They're very much first principles thinkers. And so, one of the big pieces here at X is that success isn't measured by like the up and to the right curve of what you're doing. Success is actually measured by how much are you killing at the front end so that you can make capacity for higher level impact things. And that's akin to a lot of the stuff we do with rapid evaluation. That's akin to a lot of the stuff that we do when we're vetting ideas. But first and foremost, I think the thing that makes you successful at X is that you're not just you understand that professional breakthrough is not possible without personal breakthrough. Like, you have to be willing to put your ego aside, turn up the humility factor, level set that with some audaciousness, and then go try something you've never tried before and be okay that it might not be successful, or it might just totally confuse folks. But at least, like, what do you do with the learning that comes after that? It's been really interesting. One, because you go through, first of all, this journey of like, wow, I'm here. Everyone's so awesome. You get PhDs from amazing places, engineers that have basically built the first flange on a rocket, walking around. But what's really amazing is they have such a humility and a passion towards the problem. If you're trying at X to be successful, you don't have to try if you're focusing on killing your project faster, which is very antithesis to the enterprise space, because it's like, I want to focus on launching my project and landing this thing and giving you all the metrics that tell you it's the right thing to do. At X, it's actually like, you have to have equal parts love for the thing that you're doing, that you can carry it on for the long term, but also try to kill it at the same time.
Yeah. That's so cool. I can imagine it's a very fluid, I mean, almost, again, just a 180 difference in how the traditional programs, the goal setting, the blah, blah, blah works. So what would you say, and I know we want to pivot, but what would you say is the most unique people program, or where you've had to maybe retrain your brain from the past on implementing people programs there?
Yeah. It's hard to say because there's a lot. I mean, my first year there, the journey was really looking at removing performance management, like the way that Google did it. And all I'll say about this is we look, again, that term of professional breakthrough requires personal breakthrough. What we were really looking at was not for just things to be landed, but how people landed them, the initiatives that they were going after, the audaciousness of them. Like, I mean, it's a great idea when someone goes, haha, like, that's insane. That'll never happen. I'll have to tell you about the story about the escape room experiment, which, by the way, was a massive failure. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But we learned so much about what not to do, how to connect certain things, right? But what I will say is, like, you really have to look at performance at X as, are you being a super learner? Are you wanting to grow outside of just really ticking the box to what success on the outside world means, right?
Yep.
So yeah, taking that long view, I think very important.
I think you're hitting on something that we haven't hit on in any of our prior episodes, which is I think X does 0 to 1 better than anybody. I mean, that's like the whole idea. Is like, we're taking things to solve problems that haven't been solved before, and we're trying to go 0 to 1. And it turns out when you're going 0 to 1, you're going to fail so many fucking times more than you succeed. And you have to get really comfortable with failure. And it requires a special kind of a person, because most humans don't like to fail, especially all day long.
All day.
It also reminds me of, I was interviewing for a PM, and I was doing a reference check. And this founder who I did the reference check with had built a multi-billion-dollar company, but he was a 0 to 1 guy. And we were trying to find product market fit. And the founder said something I'll never forget. He goes, if you're hiring this person to find product market fit, it's a bad fit. But if you're hiring this person to run as many experiments as they possibly can and validate or invalidate those experiments, it's going to be a great fit. And that's what it feels like actually is like the perfect employee for X, and also perfect employees for 0 to 1, is comfortable with failure, ruthlessly experimenting all the time.
Yes.
And also relentlessly optimistic. Because it takes a lot to get out of bed every day when you're throwing shit against the wall and nothing's sticking. I mean, does that sound right to you, AJ?
It's totally bang on. I mean, I think many of you know the acronym for FAIL is, the first attempt in learning, right? And like, we really live that mindset. It's become kind of like a personal like mantra for me. And then my 12-year-old, well, she was 10 at the time, and she was like, FAIL, first attempt in learning. She's like, well, does failure mean first attempt in learning, you are encouraged? And I was like, how are they teaching you acronyms in like 4th grade? That's amazing.
That's dope.
But it really is bang on though, Nolan, because I think in any companies, especially founder-led companies, and I'm not just speaking about X in general, I think what I've learned being a part of this really amazing collective group of folks is that the principles we're talking about at X, they're not just for X. Right? It literally is for those that are looking to have that long-term view on creating impact in a very different way that's not part of a boilerplate, a template, or a playbook, right? It really gets to that piece of, how do you think about a problem in such a deep way that you fall in love with it and have to work diligently every single day to pressure test, de-risk it, and figure out if today is the day it's going to sink and fail. Now, it's not just important to fail, because here's the other thing. What most folks don't realize is that when it comes to failure, you don't just stop at, okay, I failed, fantastic, I'm moving on, right? No. Now, the practice, right? Failure is the process. So remember I talked about philosophy, process, and practice, right? That's kind of my own framework of how I make sense of the world and change. If the philosophy is that you want to think long term, the process is that you have to fail so that you can learn. The practice is to actually memorialize those learnings. We often, as a, function or corporate, whatever, we tend to kind of skip that daily practice piece of, oh my gosh, okay, how am I now going to weave that learning into all of the other things that I'm doing right now? This is why we end up with, project postmortems that all kind of look at the same. Oh gosh, we didn't see that. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to trend spot some of those things. And as a people leader and as a person in talent, it's like, what are we learning? Publish the learnings, publish them frequently, look at them. But that's that piece of like the daily practice turns the process of failure into actual learning and growth. That is applicable, right? And then you can reiterate that cycle. But too often what I've observed is that people go from, I want to do this innovative thing. Oh, I failed. I'm going to go back and do another innovative thing that looks slightly a little bit nuanced, different than that other thing. And not really incorporating some of the richness of like, wow, let's sit in that grief for a little bit and kind of see what comes up.
Yeah. Thank you, AJ. I was so personally curious about what it's like to work in the Moonshot factory. Just like, great name, by the way. We should get them to think of a new name for work trials, Nolan. It's a great name.
They're good at branding, for sure.
Good at branding. But I figured it was just such a mind screen. My mind is racing around all the different ways you have to think about things now, and almost, you guys should have T-shirts. The more you fail, the more you get paid.
There you Well, here's what I'll tell you. Everything I'm telling you right now, it's all available. It's all open sourced, right?
I love
but the thing is, what I love about X is like, we're not kind of in your face about that. Like, you just know from meeting people that come there, like it's part of the DNA because of the culture that's been created. Yeah.
AJ, we'd love to hear about your failed onboarding story with the escape room. Please.
Oh, yes, that one's really fun. So we sat down as a team, and this was newly when I was just looking at taking on the new talent team that we were starting to build at X. This was about a couple of years ago. And there was this whole piece around like, how do we viscerally begin to screen people and screen them into the kind of mindsets that we have here. First and foremost, I think some of the things that our recruiters do, which is fantastic, is we kind of go the unrecruiting route, where like, we'll tell you all the things of why you shouldn't join, just so we can kind of see, like, is it still interesting, right? Yes, it's an enigma, but is it interesting? And the second bit was like, there's got to be a better way than just interview questions to figure out how, whether or not someone's going to actually really metabolize the kind of culture that we have, right? We had a bad idea brainstorm as a team. And actually this idea was laughed at, rightfully so. Like, oh gosh, what if we like put everyone through an escape room? And everyone was like, oh, that's so 2004. Why would we do that? And we were just coming out of COVID. So it was like a virtual escape room. That's kind of lame, So we're like, well, let's just try it. Let's try it. So we had a small team offsite. We came up with clues, right? But the clues were around the question was around how do we educate folks on what it's going to be like here? We were testing whether we would include it in the hiring process or the onboarding process. One was really about mindsets, values, and behaviors. The other clues were around the projects that we had. The other pieces were just really around crafting problems that are similar problems you would face at X. How would you do that? And anyway, long story long, we Googled closest escape room, really went scrappy, paid like I don't know, it was like $60 for like a session with this small escape room, like in this nondescript area in downtown Mountain View. And we, I went there and I said, hey, who's in charge of I didn't even know how escape rooms worked. Who's in charge of, putting all these pieces together? We talked with the game master and kind of had a meeting with them around, okay, I'm looking at doing this. We're looking at testing this thing. Would you guys help us with some of the clues? We got our design kitchen involved. And actually this, I don't know if you see it here, there's a black X here. That's actually one of the remnants of the clues that we had in the escape room. You had to unlock something with it and then you got, and there was a clue underneath. But it was something that we had tested, and we put probably 6 different teams through that just to test and see what the big learnings were. Number one, the process was really awesome because one, at the front end, we actually designed the clues specific to the organization, and some of the things we would already educate them in a 4-hour meeting with 140 slides, right? So we took some of those things and we said, oh, let's make them into clues, make them visceral, we'll solve them, etc. 2, there was like that camaraderie that you got with like a cohort of people that were going through it. 3, the really cool thing was that afterwards, we actually didn't need to have, for the cohorts we tested, we didn't need to have the 4-hour meeting, because then after they completed the escape room, we had a 45-minute debrief. How was that experience? What does that look like? And then as we were facilitating it, we were talking about, okay, these are some of the things you are going to encounter here at X, etc. The big failure on this was, number one, it was like, that's such a weird idea. Like, how is that going to fare with like our researchers and scientists? Like, is that not like intellectual enough? Escape room, kind of weird. But what I would say is, I think it never really took traction because there is, again, this is understanding the business component. There is still such a deep research component within that community that loves these kind of things. But then I think our miss was like, what's the deeper follow-up for the deeper part of that journey that happens after that debrief? We succeeded on the point of putting all of those critical pieces together. We succeeded on the point on, getting camaraderie with folks and having them have the psychological safety to discuss what it would be like in the factory and what it would be like working there. But in the end, it was like, okay, how do we actually do that at scale? What does that look like? Because there are some folks that are distributed. What would we do with cohorts? Yeah. Hiring tends to be super lumpy because, it's a non-revenue generating business unit. So there were a lot of those different pieces that I think needed teasing out. But the experimentation helped us see that if we could solve some of those things, we could probably add other iterations of it, right? So again, it was just more of thinking around, how do you do things differently? But then what are the learnings? So then we took some of that, and then some of those learnings were actually embedded. It turned into more of not onboarding, but more of an exercise to re-educate and reorient Xers that were already there around what our values were, what the mindsets were, what the projects are. And then it has long-range possibility if you wanted to do a simulation around it for a specific use case with a team. So those things were kind of the contributions of it. But again, it's an example of like that idea, take the learning, it evolves into something that could be more impactful.
How do you communicate that? So I completely agree with everything that you just said. Kelli says I should wear like an experimentation t-shirt because it's kind of like my thing. And I'm very comfortable with failing, but most people aren't. And so like this thing fails, it doesn't work. How do you talk to your boss about it? Like what happens in like that next conversation of like, hey, this thing like didn't work out. Like what tactically happens there?
Well, I mean, first you kind of sit down and you have to kind of break down what are the different points that you tried in the experiment and whether or not those different points, what you set out to de-risk was actually valid. In our case, we were probably de-risking not deep enough, right? So the deeper part was, what's the 1-year journey, not the activation phase, right? When you're onboarding someone, it's not just in that first critical 90 days, it's actually their first year journey. And that actually evolved into, now we have this app which is more of a learning tool and anyway, it's evolved into this other thing. But when you're sitting down, I gotta say, it's really hard because you pour a lot into like, oh my gosh, this is super creative. This is what it looks like. It's got this kind of cool factor. We did an escape room experience, right? Oh no,
and you want it to work.
And you want it to work, and you saw the joy in the folks that gave the time to help you run that experiment. I think at the end of the day, having the courage to face the fact before you go into something, right? It's a mindset thing. Having the courage to say, you know what, if you're going to be an experimenter, you're going to go in and scenario plan. And one of those plans are, it's not going to work. One of the things that I like to do with my team, for example, is, and it's in the spirit of the scenario plan and sitting down and going, gosh, we've failed. We have a pretty rigorous promotion process. And I think you might know this, Nolan, through probably, your time at Google as well. But as part of it also, I have this ritual with my team that anybody that we're going to put up for promo, etc., we write a letter to ourselves on the day we're going to find out whether we did or did not get it. And it's almost kind of that mindset shift of like, okay, I'm going to envision what it looks like when I have to sit in front of my boss and say this didn't work. What are the things that I want to anchor to make sure that's connected to the whole idea of why I wanted to experiment anyway, right? It's a first principles approach to it that gives your mindset that whole thing where you're not like trying to cover it up. We did this and we did that. And it's really more so having that intellectual honesty and the courage to say, you know what, it didn't work and here were the factors. We wanted to test these 3 things. It just really didn't make the cut. And so what am I going to do? Try to resuscitate the thing and take more time and capacity where I can actually build that effort elsewhere, right? And I think being a rapid experimenter, it's different. Go ahead, Kelli.
I've seen that lacking so much, AJ. Like just if I think about performance reviews and promotion packets and justifications the last 20 years, it's usually what did I do? Not how did I do it? There's less self-reflection than there are, outcomes. And I love that about the Moonshot Factory. I love that about your processes. We need more of that.
Yeah, I think we're always trying to get like the tips and best practices and all of these pieces within the HR and talent space. I really actually think it's a rewiring of the mindset. One of the things that I particularly love about my learning of, the time at X has been this term of dispassionate assessment. And I've said it before in our conversation where it's like you have to be as equally passionate as you are dispassionate about the thing that you're fighting for so that you can have a balanced view and really make sure that you're making a good decision moving forward towards impact. I think that it's so simple to say almost, but it's the hardest thing you can ever do.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of things in your head.
Yeah.
Strong opinions loosely held is another way that I've said that, and it is hard.
Yeah.
It's almost like arguing against yourself.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And who wants to do that?
Yeah, because you want to be right. Humans tend to just have a desire to be right versus finding the right answer.
Yep.
And I've personally found it's so challenging to argue against yourself. But if you can set that up as part of your culture and give people language to help them do it in real time, it becomes a superpower for a company.
I think that's also a very personal thing. Like, I don't know about you both, but in my career, I've seen people that want to be right so bad. And the reasons, like the next level is, why do you want to be right so bad? And that is a whole nother level of why that I think can be different for every person as far as what those drivers are and how can you break those down to help hold hands better with someone who's like that versus just locking horns.
Also, the other question there, Kelli, is like, all right, why do you want to be right so bad? But it's also like, well, what needs to be true for you to be right? And then you can kind of uncover.
For sure.
And then they're like, oh, well, this needs to be true. Great.
Yeah.
Is it? No. Can we get
Totally.
there? I actually don't even believe that. Oh, fantastic. So maybe you don't need to be right. And some people want to be so right that they go left. Sorry. Bad analogy. Scrap that.
Totally. and we just make assumptions around people, right? That's Yeah, that's the whole thing of, psychology and people. We just make assumptions, but it's amazing what you can break down and do very quickly with people when you're just curious and you actually don't have an agenda to strong arm or bulldoze.
That's right.
Getting there's another story sometimes, but
yeah, it's the first principle though, is like, we're in the relentless pursuit of truth. Like that's what we want. Like that is the outcome for the large majority of the companies that we work at, is you want to be in the relentless pursuit of truth, as opposed to the relentless pursuit of being right. Because working with people who just want to be right fucking sucks.
It's so boring.
It's hard.
It's painful. And by the way, you just outdid yourself with a new t-shirt. You've gone from experimentation to the relentless pursuit.
Yep, I'm in.
How about collaboration
AJ,
happens at the speed of trust? Boom, one more shirt. No.
Oh my God, that's a hat. Now we have a hat and a t-shirt. AJ, your background, we've talked about X so much, but your background is so diverse. It's awesome. I love it. You do so much advising, you do board work, you've wrote 2 children's books.
Yeah.
A question I have is, this advising world of fun that we're all kind of dabbling in, how do you think about it? How do you choose what companies to advise for? Yeah. How do they come to you? How does one even start to think about this wonderland?
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's being of service to those founders or those creators that want to create that impact in the world. And for me, it's mainly just in conversation, right? I mean, I started getting involved with advising because I was getting recruited at one point earlier in my career for another specific role with a startup founder who now is a dear friend, because we went through that whole process together. And I just said, hey, you know what? Let's do a little prototype of something. Like I'm equal parts thought leadership and thought doership. And so I want to build something with you if we're going to talk about something with you. Right. And then what we did was we created some unlock for his organization. Well, actually, years later, he then became a founder of his own VC firm. And he had these portcos, and we were keeping in touch. Again, it's keep in touch with your network and your community. But it was more of just how are things going? I happened to mention to him that I was doing executive coaching, just because my role when I went into my first seat leading a people team, I was not equipped. Because it turned a little bit into adult daycare, where you were just kind of soaking things in, letting the kids fight. And then you're let's write a policy so they don't fight. I was just not equipped to be of service to a leadership team that required that much, weight to carry and space to hold for them. So I went in and started to do this executive coaching certification through Berkeley. I think I've referred quite a few folks to do that, because I think personally what happened there was just this opportunity to get to know who I was, how I can authentically show up as me, versus a founder, an advisor, a head of talent, a head of HR, a head of people, whatever, all of these things, mom, dad, etc., blah, blah. I think for me, what was really awesome as I'm going into this space is, again, you look at my LinkedIn, you're like, wow, crazy career, awesome pathways. It is literally just an open source manifestation of stuff I wanted to learn. I started out in sales, guys, hawking mobile phones at a mall kiosk. Okay.
T-Mobile, though.
T-Mobile. Hey, they were not the brand when I was hawking phones for them, but much power to the pink. Magenta. My bad. So I and then that led me to, the bit around executive recruiting, which I knew nothing about, but I was I'm happy to learn. I was actually recruited by one of my customers at T-Mobile. And at the time, my only experience with recruiting, guys, honestly, was I come from a military family. Okay. Was the recruiter from the Navy coming in and asking my brothers and my uncle and everybody to join the Navy. I came from a small town in Palmdale, California, right? Where it was the military, very awesome. And so I would tell his name is Warren, from Adecco. I would say, I think I'll serve my country in other ways. And he was nope, we're not talking about that kind of recruiting. Let me show you. And that's how I got into Adecco. Then when I was at Adecco, I got recruited by, somebody that I was just following up with because they had a role that was open. They had a perfect candidate. And at one point he turned around and said, I've got the perfect candidate for this role. And I said, really? It's like, we'd love for you to work on it. And I said, what? Fantastic. I got a Rolodex of candidates. He's like, no, you're the candidate. Like, would you like to apply for this? That's how I got my foot in the HR
awesome.
ops, right? I was like, well, let me learn about that because I've only known the recruiting side, right? And then product, getting kicked out of HR. That was fantastic. Not for anything bad or illegal. I want to put that on record. It was because I'd done a lot of the HR ops stuff. I'd done the international stint of putting together a, global HR ops support center. But I wanted to do something a little bit more that was touching the people, heart, and mind side. And then I got into product. And that, I think, unleashed a lot for me. Because guess what, guys? I became a customer of HR. And I didn't have the greatest experience because there were things that I think as an employee, like on the back end, when you're building these systems, right? You're thinking, hey, this makes sense for this system. But how are you getting those folks that are actually using and having those problems involved? And that has informed my leadership kind of philosophy around being part of the front line and touching the problem with them. And so, yeah, a lot of those things, but how I get them on the advising side is just really the relationships. You never know when you're on a quest for learning,
100%.
You just never know. And then what was the other question? Just balancing all of those, or what was it? Sorry,
it's really just about how you
you're
source
good.
them. Yeah,
Yes.
that's what we're.
That was
really
it.
curious
Ages
about.
perfect.
Yeah.
And the thing I'll mention there is your network is your most valuable asset, and it sounds like you are constantly investing in keeping that network fresh and close to you to be able to tap into it, and by doing so, they start thinking about you when they have a problem that you're uniquely capable of solving. So, AJ, I want to hit you with our last question, which is, what is your favorite interview question that gets you the best signal on candidates?
My favorite interview question, would probably have to be, knowing what you know about the role now, why wouldn't you want to pursue this opportunity? Because at the end of the day, I think it's a little bit of a mind bend for the candidate who's been spending their whole time in the experience trying to get into the opportunity, and being able to get to the heart of like, why wouldn't they, helps them also see have that intellectual honesty to say like, okay, can I do that? It's a little bit of a recruiting hack, I think, for me. And it also tells me whether or not they really deeply understood some of the conversations. And it's also my favorite question as a candidate to somebody that I would be interviewing with, is to say, great, I've heard all of the things in this space, in this company. I've read all about all of the wonderful things that's happening. Why shouldn't I join? Can you tell me why? So it goes both ways.
Let's get real.
Yeah.
I love it. Back to that reflection, like that. That's been a universal thread this whole interview, is that self-reflection. Love it.
And authenticity, Kelly. Like,
of course, always
being super authentic.
Yeah, that's my T-shirt.
AJ Thomas, thank you so much for the time.
So
I learned
great,
a ton
AJ.
during this conversation.
Same. Thank you so much, my friend.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Yeah,
Love
bye.
ya.
Bye.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.